Maurice Nicoll, Psychological Commentaries, Volume 4, Amwell, July 7th, 1951. A note on buffers. If you are negative, you remember one lot of things. If you are not, you remember quite different things. This shows how the internal arrangement of our psychology or mind depends very much on the emotional state. Negative emotions, of course, belong to the emotional state. As a rule, they're practically the only emotion that we can experience. This is why so much work has to be done on the terrible state of the emotional center. Of course, if we loved God with all our hearts and souls, and our neighbor as ourselves, we would then no doubt have a different emotional center. In fact, I am certain we would. In the present state of darkness and obscurity of our emotional center, we do not love God or our neighbor. Have you ever thought about this? Probably not. To change the terrible state of our emotional center, as it is in mechanical life, we must have some idea of something higher than ourselves. As we are, we do not think that our neighbor is higher than ourselves, and we certainly do not think that God is higher. Because we take ourselves as God and only pretend to think that there is anything higher than ourselves. All this is very difficult, and it takes a long time to understand even a little bit about it. However, if we begin to break ourselves up from the illusions of ourselves, the illusion, for instance, that we are one and that we have real I and will that we can do, and that we are never negative, we never identify, and have, in short, a real I that controls us at every moment, then we will begin to see that there is something higher than ourselves. Once we realize this, we will know that these terrible imperfections, which we regard as being so excellent, are heavily concealed by illusions. And as the work says, if you were suddenly to see what you are like, then you would go mad. If, for example, you suddenly saw all your contradictions, you would go mad. Fortunately, we are not allowed to see more than we can stand. In fact, we are only allowed to see this in the work, to see a little ways ahead, where, so to speak, we can stand what we see. But if we had all buffers taken away, we would go mad at once. Buffers prevent us from going mad and giving us a sense of being perfectly all right day by day. A little child has the misfortune of being born amongst sleeping people, and at first it feels contradictions, but after time all this is smoothed over by the formation of buffers. Buffers are, as Gurdjieff said, things that ease the collisions of these contradictions, so much so that one does not notice them. But a very small child has conscience in an obscure way, whereas sleeping people do not have conscience. I mean, real conscience. But of course, they have acquired conscience and social conscience. Now, if conscience grew in us from the very first, we would go mad with the state of the world. We would see the contradictions, but we are not allowed to see them. Buffers take the place of conscience. No matter how big or little, grand or poor, you all have this disease of buffers, and you will not face the truth. In short, you will always lie. So therefore, we see from this short paper that really, to have conscience, we must see the buffers. But it is impossible except with prolonged self-observation, and often, I must say, indirect self-observation, by which I mean retrospective observation. The work teaches that we all have real conscience, quite apart from acquired conscience, which latter is merely a question of how we were brought up. Gurdjieff said we all have real conscience, but it is buried. How then is to bring it to the surface? Now listen carefully. The memory of observing I is quite different from the memories of little I's that pop up at every moment. Observing I should and does eventually make it possible for you to remember what the other I's said lower down through the scale of your machine. Through the memory of observing I, which I tend to call work memory, as you may have noticed, we see contradictions. And what is it that frees us? Conscience. If I become conscious through memory of observing I, begin to get freed from my buffers, it means that I begin to see my contradictions and will become freed from them, namely from what has prevented me from seeing them before. What has prevented me from seeing them before? Why, buffers have prevented me from seeing these contradictions. The memory of observing I is now beginning to change. And then after a time, higher centers will see that you're trying to work on yourself in a real sense and will begin to give you traces of real conscience, which is utterly different from acquired or educated conscience. Gurdjieff said that real conscience is the same in everyone, whether they be pink, yellow, blue, or green. What is my state then? If my buffers get a little weaker, do I feel confident in myself as I did before? Or do I begin to see the illusion of myself which has haunted me all this time? If so, it will then begin to be possible for me to love God and my neighbor instead of myself.